Hi, I'm Calivan. In our last video we talked about the first RTS. Now I think it's time to talk about the second. So, mine some gold, build a farm and raise an army, as it's time to talk about Warcraft, Orcs vs Humans. Long before there was a World of Warcraft, there was just a Warcraft. Blizzard Entertainment, originally known by the somewhat dull name Silicon and Synapse, had put out a handful of games in the early 90s, mostly focusing on porting existing games to other systems. But a little further down the line they decided to try a few things of their own. Their most successful release during that period was a title called The Lost Vikings, a platform strategy crossover in which you control a trio of Vikings with different abilities, who must work together to complete each level. The Lost Vikings was a success and was met with great reviews by a whole myriad of industry publications, and would put Blizzard in a position where they could go on to create bigger and better projects. Many of the staff at Blizzard were fans of Westwood's Dune 2 and were quite surprised that nothing similar had been released in the few years since. I went back and had a look at the list of RTS releases myself, focusing on 92 to 94 in particular, and was quite shocked to find that no one had tried to make a quick copy, let alone a new game in the same vein. Cheap clones were all the rage back in the 80s and 90s, so it is quite surprising that no one had even attempted it. The few games that are labelled as real-time strategy that were released in 92 and 93 are nothing like Dune, so I can only guess that it was too new and too complicated to be worth replicating. Blizzard had correctly identified a gap in the market and decided to make an RTS of their own. They chose a fantasy setting for their entry, probably for a mixture of reasons. It would be important to differentiate their game from Dune. They had demonstrated an interest in swords and axes in their earlier titles, and they were fans of the Warhammer franchise, with Patrick Wyatt, the producer, stating that the Warhammer world was a huge inspiration for their art style. The game featured two campaigns, one for orcs and one for humans, but it was a far cry from the carefully constructed stories that Blizzard would be known for in the later years. It seems almost unbelievable, but when Bill Roper stepped into the recording studio to add audio for the game, he would swiftly find out that there was no script at all. It's been reported that all of the game's story was improvised by Bill during these recording sessions, although I've been unable to find the original source for that comment, so take it with a pinch of salt. What is clear is that the developers had put the majority of their focus into the mechanics, the graphics and the playability, so the entire fantasy world that the game was built in was clearly not their primary concern. When you read any old interviews about the creation of Warcraft, it's quite obvious that gameplay was what really interested the development team. They talk about little else. It's quite funny if you think about how different the Blizzard of today is compared to the Blizzard of the 90s, and how characters, cutscenes, lore and story seems to trump interesting and innovative game mechanics every single time. A bit of an overcorrection perhaps. Anyway, moving on. Blizzard didn't just want to make a copy of Dune 2. They set out to make a quality game that included new features, and in this regard I think they succeeded. The first thing that really sets the game apart is that you can use shift clicking or boxing to select up to 4 units at once. This makes things far easier to manage and was a big improvement and one of Dune's primary problems. The second, and even more important addition was that of a multiplayer mode, where players could compete over modem or LAN connection. Back in 94 this was no easy feat, and during development and testing, network desyncs would cause repeated crashes, and the amount of time taken to locate and fix these issues was not insignificant. From what I can tell, it was so bad at one point there were calls from within the company to ditch the multiplayer mode altogether and add it in as an expansion in the future. But the majority of employees felt that the versus mode was so important that it had to stay. It looks like that camp won out, as the problems were eventually resolved and the game had full multiplayer support on its release. This was huge, and if we consider Dune 2 as the first true RTS, then I think we must call Warcraft, Orcs vs Humans the first true multiplayer RTS. However, just because multiplayer was featured, single player was not neglected, and both of the game's campaigns were enjoyable experiences in themselves. Blizzard experimented with a few different mission types, and although most of them do come down to crushing your enemy, Your objectives do vary a little, and there are some things like rescue missions tucked away further into the campaign. Some missions give you a limited amount of starting units and have no resources or gathering potential, so you must carefully micro your troops to try and achieve victory by being as economical as possible with them. The 4th or 5th Orc mission is like this, where you are dispatched to the dead mines to locate the War Chief's daughter and ensure that she doesn't run away again by murdering her. A little counterproductive, but hey, I guess no one ever accused the Orcs of being overly smart in the early days of Warcraft. Moving on from infanticide, they thankfully did away with June's insistence that you must build concrete foundations before you erect a building. There are still some limitations with this. You must construct some expensive cobbled roads to connect your buildings, but at least it was a step in the right direction. The game does have its flaws, and there were plenty of things that annoyed me during my playthrough of the Orc campaign. Firstly, you have to press hotkeys to issue move or attack orders. Simply left-clicking a location or enemy while you have a unit selected is not enough. Secondly, you must click at the edge of the map to pan the viewable window, an interaction that seems entirely pointless to me and one I don't quite understand. Thirdly, you must hold down control to box select units, which is a design choice I just can't fathom. I'm sure it made sense to someone at the time, but as I sit here in 2023, it seems like madness. These aren't the only problems I ran into, but are definitely the ones that caused me the most frustration during the time I spent playing this week. Another thing that is very apparent is that the AI and pathfinding is very basic and your units continually take questionable routes to their destination. Your workers are always bumping into each other, especially when a few of them enter a crowded town, and your income efficiency is highly dependent on properly constructing your buildings in such a way to encourage the units to pass them more effectively. The AI opponent is very much in the run directly towards you and attack the nearest target camp, and the challenge is mostly making sure that you have enough units to defeat them and enough fine control to override your unit's deep desire to headbutt each other and run into a wall. However, this isn't really a proper criticism, and for a game almost 30 years old, what they did was still impressive. I think this is what made the multiplayer so exciting as a possibility to the developers, as another human could present challenges far greater and be far more interesting and diverse than any computer opponent could. So let's dive into the game in what I think is the 5th mission in the Orc campaign. We already have a starting base, but it's under attack by some pesky humans. We're given some starting units a screen or two away, and we must use this to defeat the invaders and secure our buildings. Once this is complete, we must construct some workers and set them up mining gold or chopping lumber. We then use our newly gathered resources to reconstruct a couple of the destroyed buildings and start pumping out new units. You can immediately see a lot of things that would feature in Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 3. Not just the types of resources, but the basic infantry units are similar, as well as the use of peons or peasants to construct, gather and repair. You can upgrade your units using the tech buildings such as the blacksmiths and the lumber mill, and building wolf pens and magic circles give you access to the wolf riders and the necromancer. Further into the campaign, more units unlock, such as catapults and wizards or shaman. The two opposing forces are quite similar in most regards, with most of the basic units being the same, albeit with different icons. Things do have a bit more variety later on, but generally they play out quite the same. It's more like controlling a different flavour than a different dish entirely. The game does feel very slow at some points, and I found myself having to tweak the game speed a few times mid-play to bypass a lot of the slow waiting while resources piled up or my units were created. As I mentioned earlier, the AI is pretty dumb, so the game tries to counterbalance this by giving your opponent a lot of units, and when I say a lot, I really mean it. The first time you cross the bridge in this mission, an absolute tidal wave of knights rides out from the opponent's base and crushes everything in its way. This can be a little frustrating, as you are often defeated in fights just because of how fiddly everything is to control, and having to fight such an overwhelming force normally relies on baiting out little chunks of it towards carefully arranged bunches of grunts and spearmen. This is especially difficult for orcs, as the human priests can do a lot of healing at a very long range, and your necromancer's raise dead ability just doesn't seem to stack up very well against it. I didn't end up completing the campaign, as I'll be honest, it was a little dull and repetitive for my tastes. And although I did figure out how to win the missions I did play, it wasn't an enjoyable experience to do so. I stuck with it a few hours, so I think I gave it a fair go, but I could never really get comfortable with controlling my units and found myself constantly frustrated. This is probably just because I'm used to more modern games and things have changed a lot in the last 3 decades. However, I did find mention of an old review which describes the game as hard work, so perhaps my modern day feelings aren't totally unjustified. On reflection, I think that the first iteration of Warcraft compares pretty well to Dune 2, and it's different enough and adds enough of its own that calling it a copy would be both incorrect and lazy. The way I see it, Dune 2 created a genre, and Warcraft, Orcs vs Humans, was the second ever game to be released in that genre. Just like Dune 2, Warcraft was a commercial and critical success. It took a little while to get there, but once the reviews did eventually come in, they were generally very positive and it sold a similar amount of copies. One of the best things to come out of it was that Blizzard were now a successful company and were in a good position to develop further titles. They would follow up with Warcraft 2, a vastly superior title in every single way, to such an extent that it's almost impossible to believe it arrived just 13 months after the first. I mean, look at it. The graphics look like they're from a whole new generation. The controls are vastly improved, and everything that was difficult or frustrating about Warcraft was fixed and improved in Warcraft 2. The side scrolling was simpler, a mouse click would either select, move or attack depending on what was most appropriate, and you could drag select up to 9 units at once without having to go anywhere near the control key. The game was faster, more responsive and so much more fun to play. It really was one hell of an achievement. Like Dune 2 and Tiberian Dawn, Warcraft and Warcraft 2 would bring the genre to the attention of the masses and inspire many other developers to create new RTS games of their own. As I've said before, I think Westwood created the first RTS, but it was Blizzard's Craft series and Westwood's Command & Conquer games together as competing entities that would drive the genre further and further forward for the benefit of us all. Hi there, thanks for paying attention for the last 10 or 15 minutes. Hopefully you were edutained by my short look back at Orcs vs Humans, and if you had great experiences with this game then please let me know in the comments. As usual, if you enjoyed this video please leave me a like, and if you want more, I feel a subscribe button in your future.